So it's good to talk to you again. And I love the fact as a history professor, your work and interests go way beyond what I would consider normal history. Who knew it would include burlesque dancers?
Yeah.
And we've just curated a new exhibit at Stonewall Library in Wilton Manor on one very famous one, ZORITA. Can you tell us about her briefly?
Sure. It's thanks for having me here, by the way. It's always good to see you and thanks for the great work you do. Zarita was a burlesque dancer for sure, but she was also on the right side of history and so many of the things that we are able to kind of find in her story. She was someone who resisted, right? She knew when things were wrong. And I love the story about her that is I had been writing about her for I don't know, 15, 20 years or so. Like I wrote about her in my dissertation, which covered Miami's LGBTQ history after World War II. I knew she had a daughter, and I got to meet her daughter. And her daughter, who's Tani Patillo, who's an incredible, incredible woman, LGBTQ activist for many, many years, right? She helped me, she gave me access to her private archives that helped me piece together aspects of her story that I simply did not know, right?
Yeah.
That is, they were in many ways unknowable until you have the kind of personal touch of a private archive to kind of piece together parts of her story that simply we just, we didn't know. In tracing some of the story, I learned about the way that Zarita knew how to, she was a good publicist. She knew how
Yes.
to kind of work the media and the way she needed to work the media to get her to get a voice when women rarely had the kind of voice that she had. She knew how to kind of raise eyebrows, call attention to things that she wanted to call attention to. She, when laws in Miami were illegal, made it illegal for impersonation, she did it anyway. She was often arrested. When racial segregation, right, was the law of the day in parts of Miami and certainly beyond, she resisted that as well, right? That is, she's tried she resisted her white neighborhood integrating
Yeah.
and tried to sell her house, made it very clear that she did not care if the people who tried to purchase the house were black or white and what that meant for the neighborhood. And there's so many stories about her that simply we haven't been told. And I'm hoping this exhibition is a part of that.
So I'm guessing you're attracted by her sexuality, not the fact she's a burlesque dancer.
It's an important part of her story,
Yeah.
right? Like that is she changed the scene of burlesque in so many key ways. She's kind of at this interesting moment in kind of burlesque history when it's kind of on the burlesque is kind of changing rapidly as a kind of social phenomenon and kind of mainstream and kind of moving into by the time she begins really in the 1920s 1930s in earnest and by the time she moves to Miami, by the early 1950s, burlesque is a really different space. It's kind of transitioned into more kind of hardcore sex shows and strip shows and these kinds of spaces that are not often to burlesque and the kind
Yeah.
of artistry, no doubt. And she kind of always positioned herself, I think, as a kind of um, somewhere in between of understanding where modern audiences were
Mhm.
and what they wanted to be. She had toured. She started off in this kind of traveling carnival show right across the country as Princess Zarita, and in that kind of space, I think kind of really understood too what national audiences were looking for. And it's funny, right? Because as a queer woman, like she was always um it was kind of, I think, in so many of the newspaper reports and kind of understood that she was, men were really interested in seeing her, right? Like, and she kind of always tapped into that kind of desire. But in her life, private and also not so private, semi-public, I suppose, she really just surrounded herself by women, right? Like that is her partners were women, her lovers were women. She was really in this kind of queer network so many of her friends were gay men and um she had such she had lived so many lives, like a private modern audiences were, and what they wanted to be. She had toured. She started off in this kind of traveling carnival show, right, across the country as Princess Zorita, and in that kind of space, I think kind of really understood too what national audiences were looking for. And it's funny, right? Because as a queer woman, like she was always, it was kind of, I think, in so many of the newspaper reports and kind of understood that she was, men were really interested in seeing her, right? Like, and she kind of always tapped into that kind of desire. But in her life, private and also not so private, semi-public, I suppose, she really just surrounded herself by women, right? Like that is her partners were women, her lovers were women. She was really in this kind of queer network. So many of her friends were gay men, and she had lived so many lives, like a private
I
life.
read this quote, you must know well. She stripped for men, but loved women.
That's exactly right. And so many people in her circle too, right? Like that is one of the kind of fascinating parts of curating this exhibition and learning more about the story was that so many of the people in her circle, right, that we know even less about, right? Zorita had national and even perhaps even international acclaim, but not so many of the other people who worked in her club, who attended her shows, who we don't know that much about them. And this is a way of hopefully to recover some of their stories too.
Can you talk to us about one of her routines, for example, the half and half?
Oh my God. It's also that's on display. If I'm without being too cheesy, I think I screamed when I saw it. So she would come out dressed half as wearing a woman's wedding gown, right? Traditionally woman's wedding gown. And the other half, literally half and half, was a man's formal tuxedo as if in a marriage, right? And then she would consummate a marriage to herself on stage, right? Like that is the kind of half and half, which has now become almost like you see these kinds of routines on like RuPaul's Drag Race and other spaces, right? But that is in the 1940s and maybe and certainly beyond that. She would do this really interesting, very queer, very pushing the boundaries and the envelope, right, of gender bending on stage in places like Miami, which again had ordinances that made such things illegal. They legislated against in the 50s, where it could really kind of cause one could get arrested for doing that work, right?
She was arrested, but for two different reasons.
Oh, she was, as far as I can tell, she was kind of arrested more than once or twice for all sorts of things, right?
But once was to do not with her stripping, but the animal was in the act.
It seems like there's parts for sure where she was arrested, and she was kind of a rebel.
Yeah.
Other things too is like, whether it was these kind of spaces were raided all the time. She was at a time when women-owned businesses were nearly impossible, right? Like that is, in fact, in many instances, right, actually financially impossible to sustain without, right, a creditor who was a male, right, with a man. She was able to run these spaces, and the police often targeted them. Like that is a spaces that might have targeted, that catered to people who we're outside of like kind of mainstream's understanding of respectability or whatever. And again, she knew how to play with this really well. She understood publicity and understood how to kind of work the press to her best, to her advantage, right? To promote her work and promote the people who worked with her and for her. And yeah, she was no stranger to the law. And if it wasn't her who was being arrested, sometimes it was the people who worked for her. And she often stood, as far as I can tell.
What was snakes?
Yeah, and snakes. She understood that you needed a kind of gimmick, right? And everyone needs a gimmick, like the song. And like and that's actually where she gets it from Gypsy Rose, right? Like that is the kind of idea of needing a kind of gimmick. And snakes, but she would, she was arrested or fined, I should note, I think it's fined, for kind of walking a boa constrictor down the streets of Miami Beach. Like that's not a normal thing to do.
Where did she fit in the annals of gay history? What role did she play, do you think?
Oh, what a great question. I think she tells us stories of so many people who during a kind of period when we often think of a lot of oppression, a lot of repression, which no doubt is definitely part of the story. That is, I don't want to erase any of that. I never seek to do that. But she found space for her and people like her. She carved out those spaces. That wasn't something that just happened. She made that happen, right? That is, I see her as someone who resisted a lot of things about the era that she knew were wrong. And I find that to be very inspiring, right? Perhaps more today than ever. But that is in the kind of canon of let's say, LGBTQ history, of queer performers, of queer activists. Every day that she stood on stage, that was form of activism, right? Like and I hope that we see it that way.
It's a great exhibit. Is there life after it, after Stonewall? Do you have any plans to take it elsewhere?
We're hoping possibly to kind of see it in other spaces, perhaps in New York, right? She lived in New York for many years. And certainly beyond that, I would love for this to see the light of day. That is, people all over the country saw ZORITA. And I hope that they are able to. We also, at the end of the exhibition, I created a kind of space for people to leave their stories about ZORITA. That is, if you happen to see her, maybe perform, if you knew her, if you knew someone in her circle, the only way like all LGBTQ history, right? These are community stories. And if we don't share them amongst ourselves, they get lost and erased, right? This is the way we preserve history. So if folks have stories about ZORITA, please share them with us so that we can leave a historical record. And I don't mean just her, right? But her networks, the spaces that she traversed, something you might have traversed, right? Like that is speaking out to groups of people whose families might have come across her or her story or beyond her, right? That is, if you have something to say about this, we'd love to hear it.
Okay. So we're going to have the details of this exhibition, which closes in May soon. But I want to ask you one last question.
Yeah.
What's next for you? Another burlesque dancer?
I don't know.
I never know what you're going to pop up with next.
I got a few things in the work, a few things cooking. I love that question, and I also hate that question just because it makes me very anxious. There's so much more about ZORITA's story that I want to tell. There's so many LGBTQ stories at the intersections of race and ethnicity and class that I'm really invested in telling. I want to tell stories that we don't know and that we think we know, and here's another life to them. There's more texture to them. And we have this really great project that we won a Monument Lab a grant for. We're creating the Miami AIDS Memorials Project to help commemorate the history of HIV/AIDS in Miami and South Florida. There's a lot of work.
Past time.
That's right. That's right. And so I hope people are also able to contribute their stories there. We're doing community storytelling sessions and hearing sessions. No small collective or group of people should determine how we memorialize such a difficult and, of course, ongoing history. The more voices we hear in the way that the story is told, the better. So please share your stories with us so that we can relay them, right? I'm grateful, without being too cheesy, grateful for the opportunity to do the work that I get to do, and grateful that thank you for allowing me the space to share it.
Well,
so
gay history is very important to me. But I like the quirkiness side of it. You forget that people made such a contribution in their own different way. And it makes us eventually give us a whole picture.
Yeah.
It's important to us.
Absolutely.
So we'll remember details, and we'll remember details of the AIDS Memorial where people can contact you, because I don't want them contacting me. It's great to talk to you as always, and maybe we'll see you in Palm this time of summer.
I would love that. Good to see you.
Take care.
Take care.
I've come to say goodbye for reasons you won't understand. I've tried so many ways your hand. I've drenched you in roses and the sweetest of wines. My pockets are empty, my heart I bled dry. So go on and haunt me, go and lay down your spell. You might think that you know, but you don't know me that well. You might think that you know me